Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. John Baird Callicott. He is Distinguished Research Professor Emeritus and a member of the Department of Philosophy and Religion and the Institute of Applied Sciences at the University of North Texas. He is a philosopher whose work has been at the forefront of the new field of environmental philosophy and ethics. He is the author of books like In Defense of the Land Ethic, Encyclopedia of Environmental Ethics and Philosophy, and Greek Natural Philosophy, the Presocratics and Their Importance for Environmental Philosophy. So, Dr. Callicott, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be speaking with you.
Thank you. So my first question would be, and since I never had an environmental philosopher on the show before, what is environmental philosophy and what are the sorts of questions it deals with?
The environmental philosophy is it emerged as a response to the environmental crisis widely recognized in the 1960s. And so it began to coalesce in the 1970s. And the main issues in environmental philosophy are very fundamental. The questions are, what is the nature of nature? What is human nature? And what is the relationship between humans and nature? Those are the defining issues in environmental philosophy.
Could you tell us a little bit about how this branch of philosophy developed? I mean, is it old? Is it recent?
As I say, it became a shall we say, an official subfield in academic philosophy in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. But as many such new phenomena in the academic world proceed, environmental philosophers who were now self-identifying as environmental philosophers looked for precursors who came before. And those generally have been identified as George Perkins Marsh, a geographer, a diplomat in the middle of the 19th century who was making observations about the anthropogenic environmental changes in the Eastern Mediterranean and Greece and Turkey and places like that, and then transferred that knowledge and concern to the US and was created an interest in deforestation, for example, with an ethical aspect to it. Then there was John Muir in the late earlier still is Henry David Thoreau and his work in Walden and other works of Thoreau. He seems to be the first person who actually called for wilderness preservation. Then John Muir in the late 19th century and early 20th century, who celebrated the glories of nature and was the first person to suggest that nature or parts of it had rights. And then finally, Aldo Leopold in the first half of the 20th century, he died in 1948, was the first person to really articulate in a sustained way an environmental ethic, which he called the land ethic. So those are the precursors to environmental philosophy. And then environmental philosophers began to build on the work of these earlier figures in conservation.
Mm-hmm. Is environmental philosophy mostly focused on ethics and ethical questions surrounding the environment?
It began that way. So in fact, the first journal in the field was simply called Environmental Ethics. Subsequent journals are Environmental Values, Ethics in the Environment, and so on. So initially it was about ethics, but I think as the field developed, especially when so-called continental philosophers in the United States got interested in the field, it expanded to what one might think of as ontology and epistemology. So environmental philosophy now has transcended its original narrow focus on ethics. And I think in many ways, that was implicit in environmental ethics, and certainly in my work, the ontological aspect of it was important, and the metaphysical.
Mm-hmm. Is there any dominant ethical theory that orients the ethical work done in environmental philosophy? I mean, like, for example, consequentialism or deontology or some other ethical theory?
All of those have been evoked. These are sort of like the 20th century mainstream, and then later in the 20th century, towards the middle of the 20th century, virtue ethics emerged and then became very fashionable as in the late 20th century. So there's a virtue ethics also involved. Now, I represent a minority tradition in environmental ethics, which is now really more characteristic of what's known as evolutionary moral psychology. There have been two parallel strains of thinking about ethics, one in philosophy and the other in biology, going back to Darwin and the descent of, and his work, The Descent of Man. And in tracing the Darwinian tradition back as well as forward, it goes back to David Hume and the theory of the moral sentiments, which simply has not been pursued vigorously by mainstream philosophers, but is now at the forefront of evolutionary moral psychology, which has inherited the Darwinian tradition. So you might say that I'm sort of an outlier in terms of paradigms of moral philosophy.
Mm-hmm. So, but tell us a little bit more, or elaborate a little bit more on what is evolutionary moral psychology, and I mean, in what ways does it differ from other mainstream ethical approaches?
The main difference is, and the most fundamental difference is, that it is centered on the moral sentiments, on affect, on emotion, on feeling, as opposed to rationality, as opposed to reason. Philosophers, I think, have just always gravitated towards ethics that spring from reason, because it goes very deep into the into the tradition, back to Plato and Aristotle and Kant. Certainly the utilitarians, in many ways, their sort of hedonic calculus and so on is all very rational, but the the Hume-based ethics on sentiment or feeling or emotion or affect, as it's called. So that's the central difference at the most basic level. Darwin was faced with a kind of paradox, because it would seem, given the struggle for existence and natural selection, that as humans evolve, they would become ever more competitive, treacherous, murderous, and so on. And yet we have ethics. And so the very existence of ethics is a problem for Darwin. And so his solution to the problem is that the human struggle for existence is really pursued collectively or cooperatively, as opposed to individually. And so for a society, a collective, a community to be possible, we have to, what Leopold called, limit our freedom of action in the struggle for existence. We have to so ethics originates as a sort of glue that holds society together, but it goes deeper than just human nature. Any sort of complex animal society, like wolves and monkeys and so on, there are certain rules that are followed, and there are expectations of behavior. So in the human case, we're simply building on something that really emerged much before we became the rational animals. So you might put it this way, that reason is a late development, and it could only be possible in a social context. So how can we explain the emergence of complex cooperative societies except in a pre-rational condition, which then focuses the origins of ethics on the emotions or the sentiments or the feelings, what Hume called the moral sentiments. And we have names for these: beneficence, sympathy, empathy, and so on are the basis of ethics. And then moral psychology, as it's pursued today, evolutionary moral psychology, it tries to identify in a more refined way than Darwin did how these emotions both originated and also how they relate to one another.
Mm-hmm. So tell us then, with this framework in mind, how do we approach questions in environmental ethics? I mean, what kinds of questions derived from this approach, and what sort of answers do we have to them?
Okay, so the most pressing early question in environmental ethics was the intrinsic value of non-human natural entities and nature as a whole. So a great deal of ink was spilled and arguments generated trying to either support in one way or another the intuition, the claim that that non-human natural entities and nature as a whole might have intrinsic value. So that really is the starting point of animal liberation. I know that you've interviewed, say, Peter Singer.
Yes.
And so Singer is finding moral status, intrinsic value for individual animals based on a very classical utilitarianism. That is to say, based on the criterion for moral considerability, which is the capacity to suffer.
Right.
So then this line of thinking sort of was the foundation for asking, well, can we push this way of thinking further, not only for sentient beings, but say plants and so on. Can we find some property upon which we can rest their moral considerability or intrinsic value? So the next development here was that plants seem to have a conatus, a striving towards certain goals. And so if we can locate their value on this capacity for directed behavior to grow, to reproduce, and so on, then we might have the basis for extending moral considerability to plants. And then, well, but environmental concerns are not really so much based on individual animals and individual plants, but on biotic communities and ecosystems and species. Now, at about this point, this line of thinking then sort of comes up against a wall. Ecosystems don't have, they're not directed towards any particular goals. They're not striving to be anything. And so this line of thinking, so far as we want to develop an environmental ethic focused on biotic communities, species, ecosystems, we have to go back to the drawing board and start over. Now, in my particular view, intrinsic value is, as I like to put it, value is first and foremost a verb. Things have value because they are valued. And so the question then becomes not what that value isn't located in the things that have value, rather it is conferred upon them by valuing beings. And so we have to then ask questions as to why should we value biotic communities, species, and ecosystems, and that becomes a little bit easier to accomplish.
So with that in mind, I read in your work that one of the positions in environmental ethics is what you call rational individualism. Could you tell us a bit more about what you think are the main flaws with this position?
I think that rational individualism is what I call the sort of super paradigm, the uber paradigm. It includes both consequentialism and deontology and also virtue ethics. So they're united by a concern for only individuals and that our ethical wellspring is from reason, not from feeling. And I just think that it really is an application in ethics to a kind of essence accident way of thinking, that there is, from the perspective of ethics, some essential quality in individuals that qualifies them for ethical regard. And then once that has been established, then whether we care about them or not, reason demands equal treatment for equal interests or equal rights for those who are entitled to have rights and so on. So it's a very, I think it's a very obsolete way of thinking about things. It's Aristotelian. You have an ethical essence, and then reason demands certain treatment. And I don't think that it represents a very good phenomenology of ethics. We have to ask, really, is this the way we actually make our moral decisions, or do we not do so on the basis of things like feelings of benevolence, of empathy, of sympathy, and so on? I think that is more, that better captures our actual ethical day-to-day experience.
Mm-hmm. How do you look at the relationship between environmental ethics and environmental science?
It's a very close relationship. Most of my audience, by the way, is a scientific audience. And I serve on the editorial board of Conservation Biology. I've been on editorial boards for philosophy, but my longest serving one is on a science journal. Science claims to be value-free, and that it is objective, not subjective. This is a myth that derives, I suppose, from the logical positivists in the early part of the 20th century. Scientists realize that their research is often driven by certain values, if no other value than simply the value of knowledge for knowledge's sake. I mean, so the values are inescapable as motives, as David Hume very clearly pointed out. So, but scientists are not, I don't want to say trained, they're not, I don't believe in intellectual training. I think, I like to think that I'm educated, not trained. So the education of scientists, generally speaking, has not well equipped them to recognize and articulate the values that are actually at play in their day-to-day work. And so what philosophers can bring to the table, so to speak, is this value dimension, the ethical dimension, which they very badly very badly need, as they themselves recognize. It's not as if we're walking in and saying, you should be talking with us about values. You're not. They come to us. with these concerns because they recognize that they're as much at sea in that domain as I am in, let's say, statistics or something like that. So that's one thing. Also, philosophers are good at conceptual analysis and helping to clarify and articulate some of the foundational concepts in the various sciences. So, for example, I think philosophers can be helpful if they have the mathematical capacity to be helpful in such fields as quantum mechanics and ask, well, what is a proton or electron or something of that sort? I mean, those are really deep philosophical questions. Philosophers can have a positive role. Now, in my experience, it's been in the domain of ecology and conservation biology. And so I have frequent conversations with ecologists and conservation biologists about the conceptual dimensions of their work. And also, thirdly, the capacity to synthesize lots of different domains of science into sort of coherent overall worldview or picture. Science increasingly is very narrowly focused on very specific problems and tasks. And so scientists are not used to stepping back and really seeing how all of this fits together in some sort of coherent whole. But that's what we philosophers are accustomed to think in those levels of generality of whole paradigms. I'm very interested in, say, the micro paradigm shifts in the history of ecology, and so these are really the three dimensions, I think, that that environmental philosophy and environmental science have an interface, and a productive and creative interface.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to biological questions, I mean, is there a direct connection between environmental ethics and veganism, for example?
Well, yes, absolutely. Because in fact, I think that is the most compelling argument for veganism as an environmental argument rather than an animal suffering argument, because the production of meat has much larger environmental footprint than does meatless agriculture, and so not only that, animals contribute to greenhouse gases, especially cattle, and the land that's cleared of forests for raising of animals is very environmentally destructive. So yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I asked you that also.
I would
yes,
qualify that a little bit. I think that there is a role for some meat production. For example, here in the United States, there is an organization called Wild Idea Buffalo. And so they sell at a very high price humanely field harvested bison meat, and they their rationale, I mean, I think it's an honest one, is that it's grassland conservation that they're really interested in, and the buffalo simply enable them to conserve a huge amount of acreage by supporting their conservation activities, essentially. So there are some exceptions in that regard.
Mm-hmm. I also asked you that question because I was in fact interested in hearing what you would have to say in terms of in what ways you would establish a link with veganism, because I was considering the possibility that since environmental ethics also involves biology and conservation, if there would also be an argument to be made against animal suffering specifically.
Yes, I think animal suffering is something of concern. It's, however, not an environmental concern per se. So there is, shall we say, an argument for, let's put it this way, that veganism, why should we? And it's not just for one reason. It's not for animal suffering alone. It's also for environmental concerns. But if it's for environmental concerns, it doesn't mean that it's not for concerns about animal suffering. They're coexisting, complementary rather than exclusive or competing arguments for one and the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another question, what do you think would be some of the most important and pressing issues environmental philosophy and environmental science have to deal with nowadays?
Well, the overarching and issue is global climate change. There's no doubt about that, and it's not simply the concern that eclipses the other concerns. It also entrains them, because climate change exacerbates species extinction. It exacerbates ecological dislocation, and it exacerbates things like disease, which affects not only humans but other forms of life as well. And so it becomes an inclusive problem that we have to address, and so it encompasses all the others.
Mm-hmm. But do you think there are any reasons for us to still be optimistic about this issue, climate change?
You know, I assume a position that I call desperate optimism. And by that I mean that one it's part of ethics to be optimistic, because there is no motivation if we're pessimistic, then we give up. So however improbable and however steep the odds, we must remain optimistic in order to keep trying and look for ways to mitigate and possibly reverse climate change. And I think considering all the options, for example, there's discussion about nuclear energy as being climate neutral. And when I was young back in the 60s and 70s, nuclear energy was the bête noire that we just, I mean, it was the worst thing in the world, but now we have to rethink that. And some possibility for geoengineering now has to come into play as heinous a notion and hubristic a notion that actually is. Nonetheless, it might be something that we have to consider. Yeah.
And when it comes specifically to the potential solutions and the solutions we might develop to deal with climate change, what is the role that you think philosophers from environmental philosophy can play here?
Well, philosophers have been playing a role in climate change from about the early 1990s. The first philosopher to get involved in climate change was the French philosopher Michel Serres. His Le Contrat Naturel was very French in its way, making of nature an enemy that we have to negotiate with, and all of that. It was in many ways quite bombastic and with I think perhaps even a sense of self-mockery involved. Then in the United States, in the Anglosphere, Dale Jameson, quite without any knowledge, I imagine at that point, of Michel Serres' work, began to develop a climate ethics, and it's become really its own field. It's not really, climate ethicists identify as such, and they don't really think of themselves as being a part of this environmental philosophy community. For one thing, by the way, I might add that environmental philosophy, when it first emerged, was a pariah in academic philosophy. It was shunned, and it was the object of contempt, really. So respectable philosophers would be reluctant to identify as environmental philosophers because it would, to some extent, be professional suicide. So environmental philosophy still has no place in the most prestigious philosophy departments in the United States or in Britain or in Australia. I don't know about Europe, but it's still tainted to some extent. And so climate ethics, like biomedical ethics, is respectable. And so I think that might have been part of the motivation for climate ethics sort of breaking off into its own domain. Most climate ethicists are rational individualists, and it was in the context of my involvement in climate ethics that I developed this idea of and critique of rational individualism.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you about one last topic, because in your work, you've also sometimes mentioned Eastern philosophy and Eastern philosophers. So what can we learn from them, from the Eastern philosophers, when it comes to environmental ethics and philosophy more generally?
I think the main thing that we can learn from them is something about ourselves. In two ways, I'll get to that in a moment. Some of our assumptions are so deeply baked in, ingrained in us, that we do not realize that they're assumptions at all. They're just, this is reality. This is the way the world is. If we read or come in contact with other traditions of thought, other philosophies that are not Western, then we find that they have a very, very different conceptual architecture that they bring to their experience. Because I think that reality is constructed of experience. There is a world out there, but it is organized by means of a conceptual framework. And so if others bring a very different conceptual framework to their experience and organize it differently, then we begin to realize, hey, what we thought was just straightforward reality turns out to be in part constructed. And so then we can begin to ask, is this the best way of constructing reality? Now, let's turn to the self, which I think now has been a recent topic of my own thinking and work here, very much tied to Japanese philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and so on. I think that we have inherited from a very, very deep philosophical past, going all the way back to Pythagoras, and certainly much reinforced by Plato, and then to the extent that Plato had influence on Christianity, it's become really just part of our Western heritage, and it's very, very deeply ingrained. The self is internal. Descartes most vividly pictured it as located in the pineal gland in the brain. And so here we are, ourselves being this interior entity, sort of looking out fearfully on a foreign world through the portals of our senses, and this then makes the self atomic. It's an island unto itself in a world of other externally related selves. In Japanese philosophy, on the other hand, especially influenced by Buddhism, there is the idea of no self, anatta. But it's not as if there is no self, it's rather that the self is constituted by its relations, both socially and environmentally, so that oneself then is almost literally composed of its connections to other people, to a culture, a society, to an environment. And so I think that the atomic sense of self enables us to think that we can be okay when everything around us is not really okay. But if we think of ourselves as constituted by our relationships of immediate friends, family, fellow citizens, humans across the planet, of our environmental relationships, of our very climate, then we can't imagine our survival or flourishing apart from the flourishing of the larger world in which we're embedded, and by the way, on which we are absolutely dependent. And our Western sense of self blinds us to this dependency. So it's a very, very dangerous way of looking at the world. So I think that that's one example of the way the study of other ways of constructing the world enables us to reflect on our own construction of the world, and then, rather than becoming Buddhists or something like that, which is not really, I think, realistic for the society as a whole, we can build of our own conceptual resources an analogous or a similar way of constructing the world. And how do we do this in this particular example of the self? Through evolutionary biology and ecology, as focused on kinship of relationships and replacing our atomic mechanical worldview with an evolutionary ecological worldview, essentially. So it's right out of our own tradition, right out of our own sciences, and not just sort of picking up Buddhism or whatever and trying to fit that on ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So possibly we could adopt from Eastern philosophy and Eastern societies a more relational framework.
Not only Eastern philosophy and societies, but also indigenous ones as well. There's a lot to learn there, especially, I don't know if you're familiar with the recent work of Philippe Descola in France, an anthropologist, but he's all the rage in France. As you know, French intellectuals are celebrities, like in the US. And so his work was in the Amazon, studying animism and that sort of thing, in which, I mean, this is way oversimplified, but that their view is that all the animals are essentially human beings going about in outlandish disguises, and so they are just like us in terms of their subjectivity, but the material world is fluid and changeable. So, I mean, what can we learn from that? I mean, a sense of a better sense of animal awareness and consciousness, which is now being validated by contemporary ethology, the work of Franz de Waal, of many other ethologists, has turned ethology on its head. It used to be that you never talked about anything except observable behavior. And now, on the other hand, there is there is serious research into the cognitive capacities and emotional capacities and so on of other animals. There's here again, we're building something out of our own Western scientific tradition that parallels and resembles and is analogous to some of the American Indian understandings of the world.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So, Dr. Callicott, just before we go, would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find your work, or any other, for example, organizations you might be interested in, or something like that?
Well, I have a page on Amazon, so I think all of my books are going to be there. Just Google J. Baird Callicott and lots of stuff comes up. There'll be some YouTube videos of talks I've given. It's just, nothing in particular. Just put my name into your browser and lots of stuff will pop up. Organizations, those that I support financially tend to be small scale organizations. There's a wonderful organization in Kansas called the Land Institute. And what they're trying to do is create a second revolution in agriculture. Instead of plowing up and replanting, they're trying to make agriculture resemble the prairie cultures. So they're developing perennial grains, for example, which means that the plants regenerate, and it's much better for the soil, for the water, and so on. So that's one organization that I support. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Aldo Leopold Foundation, which is mostly focused on perpetuating the legacy of Leopold in terms of the land ethic, and also of practical conservation on a small scale, which he contributed to. Great. I mean, he was a pioneer in that regard. As to larger organizations, I'm very much in support, sort of in-kind support with, as I mentioned, the Society for Conservation Biology and the Ecological Society of America are two groups that I contribute to, as I say, and more in kind than financially. So anyway.
Okay, so Dr. Callicott, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm glad to meet you. So I look forward to perhaps further conversation.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. Please also consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke and Blanchett, Perega Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Bernardo Seixas, Paulo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Robert Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, and Zachary Fish. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.